Thanks so much to the organizers for having me. I heard really great things about the Why Should I Care event, so I'm really excited to get to participate in one tonight. Sadly, my comments are going to focus more on limitations of free speech, particularly with respect to government scientists. So as I'm sure nobody here is aware...
Sorry, what's your name?
It's Katie Gibbs.
How do you spell that?
K-A-T-I-E-G-I-B-B-S. So I'm sure nobody here is unfamiliar with what's going on. So starting in about 2008, really, we started to see a really clear shift in how government scientists could communicate their work to the public. So this started with some actual changes to communication policies within the government. So most notably, Environment Canada, changed their policy to say, just as we have one department, we should have one voice. And so up until this point, most journalists could just pick up the phone and call a government scientist. And Canada really only has a handful of dedicated science journalists. And so the few of them that have been around for decades, have the same government scientists that they've been working with for decades as well. And so it really was this clear shift where for decades they had been, phoning them up and interviewing them. And then one day they phoned the same scientist that they had phoned a dozen times before, and they had to say, no, I can't talk to you. I can't do this interview. You have to put in a formal media request to the communications team. So there really was this very clear change in how things got done. What's really interesting too is I've spent a lot of time talking to Margaret Monroe, who was a very long time science journalist for Post Media, who actually was let go recently, which is quite alarming, as she was one of the main people who was really started breaking these muzzling stories. And she was saying that it actually used to be the complete opposite, where the government would try to get her to publish about what government scientists were doing, because it was the ultimate, feel-good Canadian story. It was good PR for the government. So they would be, phoning her up, sending her press releases, saying, oh, we've got the scientists doing exciting work, are you sure you don't want to write about them? And so, now we have the complete opposite, where you really can't get any information out from government scientists at all. So this started to come to light with a few very clear examples of government scientists not being able to talk to the media. So thankfully, we have some amazing journalists who, what they did is, after getting denied the interviews, they actually filed access to information requests and found these long, sometimes comically long email chains of multiple communication staff discussing whether or not the scientists could do an interview. And so it came out, all these examples of, there was Christy Miller, who had her research on diseases in salmon published in Science, and she was forbidden from speaking to the media. You would think that Canadian scientists publishing in the top journals, that we would be celebrating this, and many more examples. One of the most incredible examples for me is in 2012, scientists who were attending the Polar Year Conference in Montreal were actually sent to the conference with media minders to literally walk around with them at the conference and make sure they didn't talk to anybody they weren't supposed to or say anything they weren't supposed to. So, as a scientist who's been to academic conferences, I can't imagine how hard it would be to actually participate in the conference and, talk to your colleagues when you're being followed around by a media person. So, that one for me is one of the most striking examples. So the Information Commissioner of Canada is actually investigating right now. So she's been investigating since early 2013 to see whether these new policies are actually legal under our access to information laws. But her office has said repeatedly that she's so overwhelmed by complaints against this government that she doesn't have the resources she needs to investigate all of the complaints. So there's been a huge ramp up of complaints, but her office hasn't gotten any more funding. So they just don't even have the results they need to investigate abuses of freedom of speech. Even just recently, one of the big stories that Margaret Monroe broke was about some technical briefing that government scientists wanted to do on polar ice. So in 2012, as many here probably know, Arctic ice was at the lowest level in history. Some scientists at Canadian Ice Service wanted to hold a technical briefing to tell Canadians about this, because it's a pretty important thing. And they had to go through 9 levels of approval in order to hold the technical briefing. The 6th level of approval eventually just canceled the briefing altogether. And so in the meantime, of course, Canadian journalists did end up covering the story, but they ended up talking to American scientists. And this is what we're seeing again and again, is that Canadian journalists end up talking to government scientists in the US because they can't talk to the ones in Canada. Which, of course, is a bit ludicrous, since we have these scientists, we have this expertise in Canada, we're the ones who are paying their salary. This is really our research, not the government's, and yet we can't get this information out from them. There's been a few, really scathing international commentary about what's happening in Canada, just to sort of bring home, how bad it is here. The international community is, noticing it and commenting on it. Even the New York Times actually had an editorial where they said that the muzzling of scientists in Canada now is worse than it was under Bush in the US. So, not only do you have the New York Times, talking about Canada in an editorial, which is odd to begin with, but they're actually saying that it's worse here than it was under Bush in the US, which is really saying something. So there's been a few actual studies into what's going on besides just these, anecdotes, really. So PIPS, the union that represents government scientists, they actually did a survey of their membership to try to see how bad the situation was. Because the government kept saying, that was just a few bad examples, that's not really what's happening across the board. So PIPS responded with this survey, and the results, basically 9 out of 10 government scientists said that they could not speak freely to the public. So this really was a problem across the board. So we actually did a study as well called Can Scientists Speak, where we actually looked at the media policies for 16 different science-based departments. And not surprisingly as well, we found that overwhelmingly they do not support open science communication at all. Many of them explicitly prohibit scientists from talking directly to journalists. They say they have to go through the communication staff, etc. I think it's important to talk about what are reasonable limits, because the government and even a lot of really respected policy people have said that these are appropriate communication policies, that any corporation would have policies like these. You can't just have any staff person talking directly to the media. That should only be directed to actual communication people. And so I think it's important to talk about this in a little bit more depth. It isn't just government scientists are being muzzled. There is a question here of, should there be any limits placed on government scientists? Should they be able to say anything to the media? So we sort of break this down into, the first level is, should they be able to talk about their science? The second level is, should they be able to talk about their science and comment on the policy implications of it? And then the third level is, talk about their science, talk about the policy implications, and be allowed to give their opinion and state that it's their opinion. So there's sort of 3 different levels there, and the first level 1, talking about their science, I think most of us would agree absolutely they should. The second and third ones are a little bit more of a gray area. My opinion and Evidence for Democracy's opinion is that yes, they should have all of those freedoms. We think that given their expertise, we think that the public has a right to know not just the facts, but to have the expert interpret those facts for them and give them their thoughts on the potential policy implications. I'll echo many of the things Kathy said. It's about having an informed public. That's the absolute, fundamental core of democracy. You can't have a democracy if you don't have an informed public. You can't have an informed public if they don't have the facts that they need to make up their minds about important decisions. And we think we all accept that freedom of the press is essential for democracy, but you can't have freedom of the press if the press has nobody to talk to. So that other end of it is also important, that you need to have scientists and experts who are able and willing to communicate that work to the public, or the whole system doesn't really work. I have lots more to say, but I think I'll leave it there so that we can get to lots of questions.